All right. Thank you all for joining us tonight for the book, The Future. This is the last lecture in our virtual series sponsored by Georgia Humanities. This lecture series is related to programming for the Guild of Bookworkers exhibition, Wildlife, which is currently on view at the Robert C. Williams Museum of Papermaking. I also like to let you guys know a little bit about the Robert C. Williams Museum of Papermaking. So we're located in Atlanta, Georgia, on the Georgia Institute of Technology campus. The museum is an internationally renowned resource on the history of paper and paper technology, and the museum exhibits feature Dart Hunter's historic collection of artifacts and books on paper and hand papermaking, tools from the early industrialization of papermaking, and changing gallery spaces. Our mission is to collect, preserve, increase, and disseminate knowledge about papermaking, past, present, and future. And we have 4 permanent exhibit spaces, 2 changing exhibit spaces, approximately 100,000 artifacts, 7,000 books in our collection, in addition to having a classroom, a book room, and we do programming for ages 5 through adult. So tonight, we'll be hearing from Dr. Sarah Werner. Sarah Werner is an independent scholar of book history, early modern culture, and digital media based in Washington, D.C. She is the author of the recently published Studying Early Printed Books, 1450 to 1800, A Practical Guide, and the newly launched earlyprintedbooks.com. In combination, the 2 works provide an introduction to how books were made in the hand press period and how we can study them today in person and online. She is also the author of articles on feminist printing history, digital first folios, an overview of the connections between book history and digital studies, and numerous pieces on Shakespeare in performance, as well as the author of Shakespeare and Feminist Performance and co-editor of PBSA. More about her scholarship and her consultancy work can be found at sarahwerner.net. I'm going to turn the screen over to Sarah.
Thank you. So I want to just start off really quickly by saying thank you to Virginia Howell and Jerishia Graham for the invitation to speak as part of this series and for making the process as easy and enjoyable as possible. And I want to acknowledge too the previous speakers and my BSA colleagues, Nick Wilding and Jesse Erickson, for their inspirations about the past and present of books. So it's now on to me to talk about the future. And when I said I would talk about the future of the book, actually my first instinct was like, I can't talk about the future of the book. It's too amorphous for me to grasp, and it's not really my area of expertise. The future is hard to know. Books could go in any direction. There's been so many, as you all know, so many articles for centuries now about the death of books and the death of reading. None of them have come true. So I think it's best to just put all of that aside, and I will focus a little bit more on something that I do know, which is old books. And I can talk about the future of old books in part because I'm somebody who researches the history of books, and I'm also somebody who's really invested in training the next generations of book historians in particular, and book scholars, and anyone who might consider themselves to be part of the world of bibliography and books. So the first thought that tends to come to mind when anybody says the future of is that we think it means fancy technology. That's what the future is. So let's start off by asking, where are the flying cars of books? One of the places that we see, in fact, sort of flying car technology is in the search for damaged type, which actually has a long history of study for it's over a century now. People have been interested in how you can trace individual pieces of type that have damage and how you might be able to learn information from that about when it reappears and how printing is being used. It's the painstaking work that Charlton Hinman did when he was looking at over 50 copies of Shakespeare's 1623 collected plays, the volume that Shakespeare scholars like to call the first folio. And his analysis in identifying the marks of pieces of type that look damaged and being able to trace where else they appeared, not only in different copies of the first folio, but also in different copies of other books that were being printed at the same time as the folio was in the printing shop, really opened up new discoveries and new understanding of the processes of printing shops, how the first folio was put together, and what other books are sort of connected with that. But it is painstaking long work. You need to look through multiple copies of a book. You need to not read it, but to look at it. And those are two different skills. It's really hard to look at a book without stopping to read the words on the page. One of the tools that can be really good at looking at instead of reading is, of course, computers. And there's been some really interesting work done on being able to use digital tools to recognize individual pieces of type. So it's similar to what you do when you are working with an OCR text. So when you're searching online through Google Books and it says, yes, we have a match for this phrase, they're using an OCR technology. That technology at its most basic level isn't really has enough of a grasp to control for like the tiny differences that you see in small pieces of type from the early modern period, especially when you see them in what you see on the right-hand side of the screen here, which are images that have a lot of noise, that are sort of pixelated. And what we're looking at here is an identification of the capital letter C from a copy of Milton's anonymous Areopagitica. We don't know who printed it. I mean, we know Milton wrote it, but we don't know who printed it, 1644. And it's been a question that scholars of a variety of sort have been really sort of interested in. And so there's a team from Carnegie Mellon of literature scholars and computer engineers who have taken a visual software called Ocular and have been able to feed already digitized scans of text through it. And so the first step for what this Carnegie Mellon team was doing to identify who printed it was to be able to say, here are all of a group of letters in this book. So they scanned the book, they identified groups of letters and pulled them all together. So here are all of the C's. And then you can look at the C's, and I say it like this is obvious. You can look at the C's and clearly be able to tell which ones are damaged. All right, you might not be able to, but if you are trained in being able to look for damaged type, you can look at this gathering of C's, identify the ones that are damaged. So in this scribe, we can see in the left-hand column are undamaged letters from Areopagitica as a point of comparison. And then in the middle column, you can see damaged type of the same letters. So when you look at that L, the undamaged one has a nice flat bottom. The damaged letter from Areopagitica has a kind of bend to it. If you look at the C in the middle of the square, you can see sort of like a bite taken out of the upper curve of it. Having identified these pieces of damaged metal type from this one printing, the team then looked for identically damaged pieces of type from books that were printed by people that they thought might have had a hand in printing Areopagitica. And you can see that when they fed different imprints through Ocular, through their software, they found a matching C. If you look across the rows of C's, you can see it has that same bite out of it. There's a break in that right leg of the W that's characteristic. And through those sorts of works, they were able to do, with the computer doing the majority of the honestly tedious labor of ping-ponging and comparing different forms of letters and do they match, they could just feed a large corpus through the software program. The software program won't interpret it, of course, but the scholars who understand what's being shown to them, Warren and his crew have now confirmed that in fact Areopagitica was printed in jointly in part by Thomas Paine and Matthew Simmons. They went on to not only identify who those printers were, but to identify a whole group of anonymously printed radical pamphlets from 1644-ish, the mid-1640s, and to be able to say, like, these were all done by the same people, and these all work together. And that's something that isn't necessarily, it's a flying car in the sense that we already had cars. We could do this work before, but we can really possibly do exciting new things with that sort of technology. There are other sort of shiny digital tools, scientific techniques that we've been turning to find answers to things that have long bothered book historians, including looking into what it is that the materials of the books are made out of. Biocodicology, if you want to have a phrase that you can use to refer to this kind of newish way of thinking about this field. Books are made of lots of things. One of the recent works that has come out has been using scientific techniques that can take minimally destructive, it's not completely non-destructive, but minimally destructive samples from bindings of books and identify protein markers, so you know what sort of leather books are made out of. Conservators, people who spend a lot of time working with books bound in leather can often identify it by sight from the pore markings and the sort of different characteristics of the skin that show up in the leather. But there's a whole world-long history of books being claimed to have been bound in human skin. And those turn out to be really hard to identify just by looking at. There's a lot of freighted pressure. Megan Rosenblum, with a team of researchers, including scientists and other librarians, have been working on getting samples from books that are claimed to be bound in human skin and looking to see, are they bound in human skin? And you might be thinking, I actually really didn't mean to spend this much time talking about it, but I'm halfway through her book now, and I'm absolutely loving it. And it turns out that some books are bound in human skin. And her book, Dark Archives, is a remarkable account, both not only of the history of those specific books and of binding and of leather making, but also the human lives surrounding and incorporated into those books. It's the sort of using books to open up new ways of thinking about our relationships to them and what books and the making of books and the handling of books reveal about ourselves. That is a really wonderful way of thinking about flying. My metaphor is getting weird. Thinking about flying cars and books. Other projects are doing similar sorts of work. Beastcraft is a British project that is also using minimally invasive sampling techniques from cultural objects to think about what sort of leather parchment they're made out of, to really sort of reconstruct the connection to early modern animals that is a strong part of book making. There are other research projects in the works in various places that, instead of being concerned about what the sort of physical elements of animals are in our books, are really interested in the traces of humans, dust, hair, oils, stains, all of these things that leave marks either deliberately or accidentally in the gutters and on the pages of our bound books, and are trying to use that information to tell us more about past lives of human history, not only about past books, but about what, DNA evidence from people who lived maybe 500 years ago. There's other sorts of scientific questions that can be answered with technologies that we have now that we didn't used to have before. Smells of Heritage out of University College London is doing something that seems a little bit more challenging to me, identifying and understanding the smells of books. Smells are hard to capture. They're hard to categorize. We don't have a great language for describing what smells smell like, and every person, it varies from person to person what they smell like. But they have Solid phase microextraction fibers, I don't even know what that means, that can capture odor molecules to help the researchers understand what specific molecules are circulating in these sorts of closed spaces with lots of old rare books. This is in the Dena chapter, the library of the Dena chapter at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. And they might be able to tell us more about how smell can be used not only as a diagnostic tool, which it can be used, mold, anyone who works in conservation in any sort of cultural heritage institution can tell you that if they're trained, they can smell when mold is happening. They can smell other sorts of problems they might be circulating. But maybe smell is not only a diagnostic tool for the preservation of old books, but maybe smells can tell us about how the past used books and book spaces. This is just a diagram of the molecules that they and other research teams have identified as making up what you might think of as old book smell. It's that sort of vanilla-ish smell that you get from decaying paper, usually, is what it is. And I find it sort of fascinating, in part with this diagram does a really nice job of juxtaposing that very scientific language about and the diagrams of the molecules of what smell are in juxtaposition with a really well-loved book that now I'm looking at it and I'm a little bit upset that it's not on some sort of book support, because look at that spine. That's not good handling. That's an aside note. One of the things that I find sort of really fun in thinking about smell of books, versus sort of like imagining a future of old books, is the ways in which smell isn't physically attached to the book itself. It's physically part of the book. They're odor molecules, but they spread. And so maybe what we think of, like, where does a book end if you can smell it from 2 feet away? Not a scratch and sniff book, although those too. Just any book. When we think about that buffer of smell, maybe there's ways in which we can think about how books intermingle with each other in terms that aren't about necessarily immediate proximity, but other sorts of auras, maybe, is a weird way to put it around books. So those are some scientific flying cars that I see happening now, that I see having useful implications for what studying old books in the future might be. Those I think are pretty exciting. I could not tell you how to do any of that stuff that we just looked at. But some of the shifts that we are seeing and moving into the future of old books really can seem the most banal, and I think it's the most exciting, and it's taking pictures of books. So we have, of course, been taking images of books for almost as long as we've had some form of technology to do that. The earliest facsimiles of rare books were lithographic images in the mid-19th century. By the early 20th century, that reproduction was really picking up pace with photography, and then with the arrival of photostat machines. Like you can see on the right of this screen, that big machine along the wall is a photostat machine in the National Archives in 1936. Photostat machines enabled libraries to make their own facsimile images that they could exchange with other libraries. So if they didn't have a book, but they wanted it, instead of like trying to borrow the book itself from a library halfway across a continent, they could have images made of it and then send them to their colleagues somewhere else. It made it easier for researchers to use them too. We'll still come across photostat facsimile leaves in a copy of a book that might be missing its original leaves. And you'll see these white on black print. Those are usually from photostat images. And that, of course, doesn't even get us into microfilm. So microfilm is an incredible, loved and hated medium for sharing images of old books, that more so than the photostat machines. You can see that the microstat machine is, the microfilm camera it's small. It's just a camera on a tripod that uses a very small format. Again, really increased the pace in which books were being able to be imaged and be shared. And also, slightly separate story. Microfilm, it turns out to be a really pretty stable medium for preserving books. We thought that for a while, and then we thought maybe fancier things would be fancier and better, but actually modern film stocks tend to be really stable for that. So taking pictures of books has been happening for a long time, but with digitization, in which it is so much faster, not only to take the pictures of the books, because you have that picture immediately, you don't need to send off the film somewhere else, you don't to get it processed, but also so much faster to disseminate it. It's really sort of changed the world about how we interact with books. And I struggle, this is a sort of a boring thing to look at, I really struggle to try to find a slide to show you that could somehow represent the exponential growth of digital collections. And the best thing I could do to sort of convey this is to show you this list. So this is just the start of the list that I maintain about early modern digital collections that have non-commercial open access policies. It came from when I was having to do research for my website, and I needed non-commercial usage, I needed public domain, and so I started maintaining this list. And those tabs you can see across the top, that's just a tiny portion of what's on this list. There are 24 institutions. Sorry, I'm just moving my cat. She doesn't like it when I pick her up. I have listed 24 institutions with collections that I love. There's another 6 aggregators that I visit often. There's 7 collections that are great, but they don't have licensing that I like. And again, I just want to say, this is a tiny, 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 tiny slice of early modern digital collections, let alone digital collections that focus on all of the other centuries of book and book history and manuscripts we have out there. It's so large, I can't really grasp that size in my mind. The best I can do is to give a couple more examples. There are images of almost any major book that you can want to find. There are, at the moment, about 25 copies of Shakespeare's First Folio online. This partial image here is the Bodleian's copy. There are 27 completely imaged copies of the Gutenberg Bible, which is a huge percentage of the ones that have survived. This one here is one of the Morgan's copies. There are multiple copies of the Nuremberg Chronicles. The one here is a really pretty one from Cambridge University Library. These are the big heavy hitter books. These are among the books that when you say to somebody, I work with rare books, they think, oh, the Gutenberg Bible, for better and for worse. But one of the things that being heavy hitters means is that even for researchers, even for highly credentialed researchers who specialize in these works, being able to see them in person can be really difficult. And I don't mean even just in terms of the logistics of travel, and do you have circumstances in your life where you can travel somewhere that has these books and look at these books. I mean that sometimes even getting permission from librarians to look at these books can be really hard. The Folger Shakespeare Library has a tremendous collection of Shakespeare, both the first folios, the 1623, but also the early quartos that his plays were first printed in. And generally speaking, they are so desirable for researchers to look at that they have just been preserved so they aren't handling too much. And that's not an unusual thing for libraries that are really trying to balance usage now with preservation for the future. Sometimes we humans, we are hard on things even when we love them, and even when we wash our hands really carefully and turn the pages really carefully. Wear and tear is a real thing that happens. So it's amazing to be able to have these big heavy hitters, multiple copies of these big heavy hitters available for anyone to look at, and to be able to read them online for free is a sort of radically open landscape that wasn't possible before. But there are other less famous works as well that you can find online, and I just grabbed kind of a handful of ones to show. You can look at, so sort of starting up in the upper left corner, a multilingual 17th century phrase book, and in the middle, an 18th century German-American edition of Pilgrim's Progress. You can see it says it was printed in Pennsylvania. an early 17th century violin solo, a late 18th century Japanese picture book of brocades, and in the bottom left corner, a late 19th century ledger from Carnegie Hall, which is a little bit hard to read the way it was reproduced. I mean, these are literally just things that caught my eye as I was looking for examples to be able to show. It's nearly impossible to choose specific the most exciting things from when you're browsing online. There it is an abundance of digital images that are out there. And we could spend some time talking about the downside of digital images. I do want to pause and say that for the type of research that I do, for the type of research that Nick and Jesse do, looking at pictures of books is often not enough, doesn't tell us enough information about what it is that we're looking for. So when I'm looking at a picture of a book, I cannot feel the paper. I cannot usually see the watermarks. It's oftentimes I can't even see the end leaves of a book because they only want to image the middle, the text block, the text portion of a book. It's actually very hard to get a sense of size from looking at digital images. There's lots of problems. You get fingers in scans. If you look at that little dictionary in the left corner, you can see this is how I grabbed the image off of How to Trust. And it's from an image the library used Google to digitize their copies. And there are so many fingers turning the pages in that. I kind of love it. But it does show, I mean, it's not perfect, but it is a huge shift in how available rare materials are for researchers. They used to not be. And in fact, not only is there just this huge circulation and availability of digital images online of rare materials, there's the power of phones. It is so hard to walk into a rare books reading room these days and not see people taking pictures with their phones, sometimes still with cameras, but almost usually with their phones of the objects that they're researching. There are some libraries that don't allow that. Sometimes you run into copyright issues. That makes a lot of sense. But it's so ubiquitous that I think it can be easy to forget sometimes how powerful it is to have this device in your pocket that you can take your own pictures of your research. And sometimes you take pictures of your research just so that when you leave the library and you're squeezing in a couple of hours at night or on the weekend, or when you are somewhere else and cannot be there, you still have access to your research. You still have access to materials that otherwise would normally be locked up and you'd have to wait to be able to consult them. But not only that, you can share your pictures wherever you want. So they don't just hardly ever just live on your phone. You take pictures and you post them on social media. You send them to a friend. You post a picture of yourself saying, look, on Twitter, saying, look at this cool book that I just found. And then people chime in and ask you for it. The phones really disseminate, in readers' hands, disseminate images of books in a way that is not like what was possible before. And it's not just that phones are really powerful. I think phones are also really intimate and create a really intimate relationship between readers and books. And I don't see that capability of phones. Phone capability is going to change a lot. But this is just a screenshot of just like a tiny portion of the pictures of books that I carry around on my phone. The vast majority of research items that I take images of, they live in the cloud, they live on my computer, they live someplace where I'm doing research and I have software to manage it and all of that sort of stuff. But also, some of these, I look at these pictures and I just love these pictures. I love that they remind me of the time that I was in Glasgow and somebody showed me this book, or the time that I was down at GW and I saw this amazing, the Bible with the blue ink. You can see there's actually a bunch of images of that. It's a great Bible, and at some point in that one's dated 83. At some point definitely in the 80s, maybe also starting in the 70s, somebody had access to this book and just wrote in it with blue ballpoint pen. And I love it. This is somebody who was clearly working through some problems that they were having about politics and religion, and maybe not maybe not how you want your great Bible treated. But to be able to carry those pictures around with me and to feel this connection with them, to feel like I own these pictures, I own these books, just being able to carry them around with me creates a relationship, I think, between not just researchers and old books, but anyone in the books that they are taking pictures of. I will never own a great Bible. I do not want to own a great Bible. I just want to say that. Like, I do not want to own any one of these things that I have pictured, except for maybe that weirdly messed up digital printing one down on the bottom. That's not actually my phone pixelated. That book is pixelated. And I can't even remember where I took that picture, so I can never find it again. But there is something that is a very powerful relationship between being able to take pictures of books and be able to carry them around with you. And I want to sort of, it brings me, I'm zooming through this a lot faster than I was. I hope I will be happy to talk about any of these things when I wrap this up. But this intimacy brings me to my final point about the future of old books. And that's access to rare materials is expanding to audiences that previous generations of scholars and librarians didn't consider. Audiences that they didn't consider because they didn't think that they were worthy of being in libraries, that they weren't educated enough to appreciate these old books, that they were too risky to let people touch them. But libraries now, I think there's really a shift in thinking about what we consider to be a rare book and what is worthy of being collected by individual collectors, but also by institutional collectors. Individual collectors are often at the forefront, the leading edge, and that's where institutions get their collections. But really being able to sort of expand past the usual things that we imagine when we think of old books to much more exciting emerging collections like the Zine Library at Barnard back in 2005-ish, I think. There was a group on campus that had an idea that they wanted to start a zine library. And so they got some funds, a few $100s, and they started buying zines. They specifically, so zines are, you could Google and find it, but zines are basically sort of like informally produced, cheap, ephemeral literature that circulates. It used to be that they sort of circulated more than they were sold. They're usually Xeroxed. Oh, that was an old technology. Xeroxed or mimeographed. And the thing that's sort of amazing about zines is that they are precisely the type of physically delicate, ephemeral materia created by groups who are outside of mainstream representation, which is, after all, why are they producing their own community zines, so that they have a space where they can speak to each other. Barnard is not the only library that collects zines. Barnard's does have a specific focus, which makes sense for a women's college of collecting zines by women and non-binary creators, and emphasizing specifically on zines from women of color. But there are lots of different zines and collections in lots of different libraries. It really seems to be a growing moment right now. There are tarot cards at MIT. They're not just the sort of the tarot cards that you would buy. The Coleman Rider, I am not a huge tarot person, so I'm briefly forgetting her name. These are not the standard cards. These are the sort of like the independent artist-produced tarot cards collection, and they have a large collection of them at MIT. Playing cards, the Morgan owns early tarot decks. And playing cards have been collected. The Beinecke owns a great collection of early playing cards. But this sort of 21st century collection of 21st century tarot cards, something valuable that you can learn from and that we can preserve, imagine 100 years from now, what you might want to do with these things. And really recently in the news, the Lilly Library in Indiana just bought a collection of romance novels in English that was created by the bookseller Rebecca Romney. And it is a collection of romance novels that starts with sort of the early forerunners, but includes, as you can see from the screen, the sort of reading that many of us were taught and still are taught is embarrassing, and is disposable, and honestly, that can be really hard to collect because they circulate in used copies. You buy it, you trade it off to somebody else. Most romance novels are printed in forms that are meant to be cheap to make, not long lasting. I mean, they were certainly not considered something that was worthy of study, or a collection by a fancy library. So these were just, I mean, this was in the news. This is why I chose this one. The other ones are just recent examples. There's lots of different ways that I think these are just the tip of the iceberg in which the ways in which libraries and librarians are expanding the notion of what should be in a library. And the final thing that when I think about where all of this leads us to for the future of old books is to ask who are in book spaces. The most exciting thing for me about the future old books is not the flying cars, it's not the gadgets, it's the ways in which our world has shifted to make not only to make rare books accessible to more people, not enough people, but more people, but also then starting to see shifts about welcoming more people into book spaces, into special collections libraries, into public libraries, into bookstores, into zine fairs. I don't think that any of those spaces are yet fully equitable. There are a lot of habits that die hard in those spaces. This was the image that I found that used the Library of Congress reading rooms, the old cards that they used to have on the desk that told you, look at all of those rules. And for those of you who have spent any time in one or more than one, especially rare books spaces, you know that oftentimes people are welcomed in through gates and through locked doors and through showing your ID, through applying for permission to be inside and following all the rules that are posted in order to get your reader's card. But those are changing. I think there's new generations of custodians of these spaces and of the objects in the spaces who see their value and see their future in opening up access to them. The one last point I'll make about that was such a happy future that I just painted, and now I'm about to say, but the future of old books is also tricky because there's not enough funding. For most places, libraries are being cut within universities, public libraries are being slashed by governments and by public voting measures that are oftentimes not fully clear. One of the advantages of making sure that those spaces are open and are welcoming and connect with the people in this world that we currently live in, not the world that as it was imagined to have been by powerful men 200 years ago, but the world we live in now. If libraries and book spaces don't reflect that world we are in now, it'll disappear and there won't be a future of old books. I know you all agree with me on that and feel that, but this is partly why when I think about the future of old books, I move from the shiny cars to the people who create and study the objects, and that's the future. And I think there's lots of exciting possibilities for things to happen there. So thank you for listening to my brief view of what the future might hold for us and working with old books.
Thank you so much. There's so many amazing projects going on. I had two questions. That the examples that you gave in terms of kind of the photographing of the books, can you talk a little bit, do any of the examples that you mentioned have an interactive quality to the way that they're presented online? And do you feel that something kind of gets lost with the translation from the physical book to digital format?
That is a good question, and I totally didn't talk about that. And yes, it is not. What I often say is that we are living in the version of the incunable age for digital technologies. Our digital technologies, especially for the ways that we still think about how they connect to books, are just not yet. There's not yet fully imagining what books can be. They tend to focus on showing you what the text on the page is, and not really to focus on all the material aspects of the book in their hands. And I do hope that there are, I'm thinking about books with movable parts, flat books and discs that spin, and the pull tabs that make things move. All of those are in old, rare books as well as modern books, and books are fragile, and it would be amazing if there were a better sort of digitization happening of those books that would let you interact with them in a way that we can't always in person. There is a loss now. I love digital images, but not as much as I love holding a book in my hands. But I think the trajectory is to do better on that end.
And I don't know if this is exactly the same question or slightly different, so I'm just going to read it. This is from Judy Barras. Hopefully I'm pronouncing your last name correctly. It said, wondering if you would address the interface interaction between libraries and archives.
Oh no. I'm not entirely sure what that question is asking me. Is it about the relationship between libraries and archives and how those are different spaces and have different functions?
So Judy, if you could maybe clarify a little bit your question, and while Judy may be typing, I'm going to come up to Paul Romaines. Is opening up collections, you point to new audiences and collectibles, the sort of materials for collections like zines, as well as welcoming new audiences like high school students. You talked about scholars and caretakers, but how would you talk about how the market, and by extension, collectors? That's seems like we might be missing one word there, Paul.
Yeah, I feel like there's a verb that I'm not sure what the answer what that is.
I guess the market, what's available to collectors is, I don't know if this is what Paul's getting at, but what's available to collectors is kind of dictated by the market as well.
Right. Well, so but it depends on what you're collecting. So you could decide that 17th century books are your thing. And you're going to buy up lots of examples of that's what you want to collect. You really love them. Or, 18th century newspapers. You could, the market will, depending on your finances, the market will price you out of a lot of that material, which will make collecting a really different experience. But you could collect zines. You could collect, zines are cheap. And you could trade zines. You could collect. Does somebody collect train tickets? I know train tickets aren't books, and I guess I should pause, and I should have said this at the top. When I think of book, for me, is sort of a difficult term, and we tend to use it. Nick talked about this too. We tend to use it to refer to like a book that you hold in your hand, and I really want to use it in this moment as like textual objects, whether they are bound in a volume or whether it's a loose piece of paper. And I can think of things that people could collect that aren't going to be dictated by the market, but could become future cornerstones for future markets. So some of the items that Rebecca Romney was acquiring for the collection that she then sold to the Lilly Library of Romance novels, a lot of those you could find without spending a lot of money. You just have to know what you're looking for so that you can spot the interesting examples among the plethora of stuff that you just want to read. So I tend to think that one thing that I recommend a lot, actually, is the Honey and Wax Book Collecting Prize. Honey and Wax is a rare book selling shop run by Heather O'Donnell in New York, and she and Rebecca jointly sponsored this collecting prize for women in the United States 30 and under. And the collections that these women build, and these are not young women with tons and tons of money. These are young women who have really strong interests in particular areas, and they build up great collections. And it really does, reading through the reports of who the winners are and the honorable mentions really can open up your eyes about what collecting is. It's not old, expensive stuff. Collecting is a purposeful gathering of material. So you want to collect train tickets, I am here for that. I actually would love to see a collection of train tickets because we don't see paper train tickets anymore, right? Like that, I couldn't imagine. If I could get the equivalent of train tickets from I don't know what it would be, from 18th century England, Hackney tickets or something for the coach, that would be a fortune. That would be amazing if we had those. So I can imagine somebody collecting them in a way that is purposeful and being able to say, this is how this fits together, then being acquired maybe someday by an institution that sees that as valuable and then becoming a research object.
And that leads us back to Judy's clarification. So she says something like zine seems to me to be more an archive object, maybe also the romance novels.
Oh, so okay.
Library versus archive.
I tend to thank you for that clarification. I tend to use a pretty traditional library, archives, school, information studies understanding of the differences between libraries and archives, in which an archive is the way in which we talk about a collection of documents that, I can't even think of how to say what an archive would be. A company has an archive. Your doctor's office has an archive of patient records. We don't like to think of it like that, but that's what that is. The Norton Publishing would have an amazing archive of materials about their business practices and about the stuff that they sell. Libraries tend to acquire individual objects that fit into their purpose. So sometimes they might acquire 100 books, a lot, a bunch at once. They might acquire in archives. A library could decide. Okay, so the Harry Ransom Center. I'm trying to think of an example. The Harry Ransom Center is a library that is full of amazing stuff. They have a Gutenberg. They have a First Folio. They've got all the fancy old stuff. They have a lot of fancy new stuff too, so that they have the David Foster Wallace archives. And those are Wallace's, not only his drafts of papers, his correspondence, his personal material. That is an archive that has been bought by a library. That makes sense. So when I think about zines, the individual zines are collected together into a collection. It's not a reflection of an organizing principle of an individual or an organization. I'm sorry, this was not a good definition of archives on my part. If somebody wants to type a better one into the chat or the Q&A, that would be sort of helpful. But I guess part of what I want to say is an archive can be made up of books, or it can be made up of pamphlets, or it can be made up of sheets of paper or audiovisual recordings. And the same thing is true of a library. A library can collect all of those things. It's how those objects relate to each other that's different. I wish I could answer that better for you. I'm sorry.
I don't currently see any other questions in the Q&A, but I was kind of curious about the DNA studies? I know they're doing this with older books, so there wouldn't be as much of a minefield, I guess. But I'm curious, what are some of the things that they're learning from doing these studies, and do you foresee them running into issues if they try to apply these to newer books?
Yeah.
Because the kind of personal information, your
Right?
DNA. Yeah.
Yes. Super personal information that we don't realize that we are shedding, or we realize that we don't want to think about the fact that we're shedding it all the time behind us. Um, I have to say, I don't tend to focus a lot of attention on what type of work and what type of information those research projects are finding, because I tend to be interested in books for their bookishness and not as a database of human DNA. It's sort of how I feel about it. But I think that's a really interesting question about the privacy rights and how is that gonna? I mean, what do you do if you pull up the DNA, even from a sort of like rare material that was handled by somebody earlier this century? You could easily find a hair in there from somebody who has grandchildren alive now, right? Like that would not be. I just realized I referred to this century as if it was still the 20th century, and it's not. But you know what I mean. You could pull up a book within, and there's still grandchildren alive. And I think that yeah, I don't know where I was going to go with it. Say I got distracted in part by Paul's response just now about sort of like archives. Um, is really helpful, that the individual pieces have a significance between them as part of a history of X, right? That a business or an individual or an organization, whatever it is. But a library doesn't have, there's not significant relationship between individual books in a library necessarily. Mostly though, I want people to value books for books. If you're running a library, there are lots of things that we can do with books, but if we start thinking of them too much as information sources for other sorts of things, I worry that we'll forget to prioritize the safety of books, and instead we'll be like, oh, well, it's only a centimeter wide bit that we want to cut off of the binding, and next thing, like, you can't do that. So partly for me, it's a question of sort of prioritization. It does point, one other thing, I was thinking about sort of the beast to craft, which I think is different because it focuses on animals, and we do not accord animals the same right to privacy that we do humans. And they tend to talk about, sheep that were alive back in the Middle Ages. So I don't know if those sheep's descendants care that we know what their hide was used for. But those are, I find, sort of interesting projects, in part because they illuminate a relationship between people and animals in a sort of way of living that in the Western world is not the same anymore. And I think it gives us a helpful way of thinking about the past and our relationship to the past, and thinking about alternate ways of how we understand communal living, and also craft. So for those of you who are book makers or paper makers or any one of those makers things, a lot of what we know today about how old books were made are because there are people making books now. So we were chatting before about Tim Barrett, who's a paper historian out at Iowa, who's amazing. And Tim knows so much about paper. And part of why Tim knows so much about paper is that he has spent a lot of time trying to make paper, and often successfully making paper. But part of the reason he understands so much about what paper can and cannot do is because of that hands-on quality. So in that sense, some of those programs maybe to me seem like there's a bit more going on in them. I might just be being really harsh about the human DNA one.
So we do have a couple more questions here. Nick Wilding says, any thoughts on how you should think about or study early digitization projects?
Oh, Nick. Hi, Nick. Yes, I have many thoughts on this. And I briefly, I had to put it aside when I had to move on to another project, but was really fascinated with digitization for a while and imaging projects and tried really hard to dig up information about. I wanted to know for a while what was the earliest digital facsimile of an old book. And what was that book? What I really want to know is what was that book? Like, what was the time where people were like, I'm going to create a website, and there's going to be books on this website, and so I'm going to image X. And I suspect X is probably a Shakespeare folio, because you can get a lot of money for things having to do with Shakespeare. And the thing that's really frustrating when I was trying to research that is those histories were not recorded when they were happening because people weren't thinking that they should be recorded for posterity. And digital frameworks in particular die. So it's both hard to find records of, the easiest thing to do is to find records of funding. So to go to the NEH, the National Endowment for Humanities, or for state humanities agencies, and look up grant applications and then read through all of that if those are publicly available. But the interfaces on which we see those things on the internet, those are long gone, and they're hard to know, and they're hard to recover. Sometimes you know a site existed, so you can go back to the Wayback Machine and you can see how it was presented, and a lot of the software doesn't work. Wayback's platform, so you miss the little flash, the flash technology, which has now died. But I do actually really think that it's a moment of book history that is in danger of going missing. And I don't know what lessons we could learn from that, but there's definitely something. There's definitely something. So I do wish that we had a better record and better resources. It is one of the things about digital, I will say this about digitizing books in the ways that people thought about microfilm as a preservation strategy, and people have thought about digitizing books as a preservation strategy, not simply for like, now this book doesn't need to be handled as much, and so therefore there'll be less wear and tear on it, but you sometimes get suggestions. I mean, you still get suggestions to see this now. There's a hurricane coming, and then a library gets flooded, or an archives gets flooded, and its records gets destroyed, and somebody says, well, why weren't they digitized? But digitization only lasts as long as you have the infrastructure to maintain it. It is what you really end up when you image a book is now you have to preserve the book, and you also have to preserve the digital image of it. Digitization is great. It offers all sorts of things, but it does not make saving for the future easier. I'll just put it that way. I was just noticing a comment about the tension that libraries in particular have between allowing their items to be used by readers and the drive to preserve them for the future is one that libraries are constantly negotiating, right? And there's not a hard and fast right and wrong to that. It depends on the object, and it depends on the purpose of a library. If you're a teaching library, your goal should be having objects that can be handled regularly by students. And if it's too precious for that, maybe you should think about where you're spending your money, which is easy for me to say because I don't run a library.
So Judy Barris says, how to preserve books that are born digital?
There are very smart people who work on this at the Library of Congress and at various digital books labs. There are scholars who study this. It seems like in some ways it's easier to preserve a book that is born digital. So two things. One, I think it's in some ways easier to preserve a book that is born digital because it's just one medium, and you're not running into that problem that Jersey and I were talking about earlier in the Q&A, where you have a paper book in your hand that is meant to sort of operate in one way, and then you take pictures of it, and those pictures operate in a different way. At least a born digital book is staying in its digital medium, and so there are ways that you can't abandon it. You have to constantly be transforming it into its next medium, its next software iteration. But the Library of Congress has a whole great world of research into how to do that. So it's definitely it's beyond my skill set. But it's possible. I mean, digital stuff isn't necessarily more ephemeral than printed stuff. It just has different care requirements. Is my take.
I'm smiling because as I know a crafts person, I would probably take it in the reverse, print it off and bind it.
Well, you could, but then what would you do with the born digital books that have like video in it?
Oh, that's true.
Yeah, and I don't know how you put that off.
A whole nother
It's the
level.
translating medium where I think is where it gets really tricky. You have to really think about.
Well, Sarah, as much as I'm enjoying this conversation, it's been a great presentation, but it is 9:00, so I'm going to close us out. If you guys will allow me to show my last couple of slides here. So I just wanted to thank all the presenters in this series, Dr. Nick Wilding, Dr. Jesse Erickson, and Dr. Sarah Werner, for this series, the book Past, Present, and Future. If you enjoyed this series, this talk, please consider making a donation to the Robert C. Williams Museum of Papermaking, and that can be done at mygeorgiatech.edu/giving/papermaking-museum. And then if you'd just like to find out more about the museum or check out the Guild of Bookworkers exhibition, you can go to our website, paper.gatech.edu. We're also on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Pinterest. And our next virtual programming will be a papermaking demonstration and lecture by Cynthia Lawless on Tuesday, November 16th, from 7:30 to 8:30 Eastern Time. You can find the link to register. It's free, but you need to register on our website, paper.gatech.edu. Thank you for attending, and we hope to have you with us for other programming.